Is a minimally viable product, and it's difficult because when we did the research, we were trying to define it for medtech, and it's very well defined in the software space, not as much in the medtech space. And we saw no less than 80 different definitions of minimal viable product. It really spans the gamut. So we really tried to understand what does it mean for medtech. And like I said, it started out in software in a space where you can bring a software, your beta version, to market very, very quickly. You can test it with real market feedback. You can iterate on the design, and you can actually bring out your next version pretty quickly. This is not the case in in the medical device space, and nor should it be. This is a highly regulated industry. This is an area where the risks of what you bring to market are very, very high. So how are we going to redefine what MVP means for the medical device world? So after looking at all of the 80 plus definitions out there, this is the one we landed on for today and for today's discussion. So MVP is a product which has just enough features to gather validated learning for its continued development. I think the key to this definition is continued development. This does not imply that the product in your minimum viable product is actually the product that you're bringing to market. It's essentially a tool that you use to gather learnings throughout the product development process. So it's not your final product, it's something that you use to continue to learn, and you may have 5 or 6 of these along the way in your product development strategy. So for example, it might be a napkin sketch that you're getting some initial feedback on. It might be a physical prototype, or it may even be the product that you're bringing into your clinical trials. Those all require different strategies. And yes, you're trying to get to a commercial product at the end, but you might need to tailor or stage your approach so that you're defining the right things for those milestones. You really do want to look at the milestones in your program. I think most of the organizations that we talk to, they typically are bringing a napkin sketch or a device, a prototype, and saying, we want to bring this to commercialization. Can you help us get there? And really the goal of your MVP should be to decrease risk and increase value along the way. And usually that's through gaining critical user feedback. Your MVP can take different forms. So let's say you're trying to get your next round of funding. You really want to make sure that your minimum viable product speaks to the milestone that you are targeting. And one of the examples that I think is valuable is when you're trying to get your next round of funding, what is going to matter to those investors? Or if you're in a larger organization, what's going to matter to your leadership team to make them continue to fund you or have them continue to fund you? It may not be just moving through the commercialization process. You might need to tailor your strategy specifically for that, because if you don't get the funding you need, you're likely not going to make it to commercialization. It's not, most people expect that the path from idea through to commercialization is actually a straight line. In reality, it's not, and that's really, again, you need to adjust that based on milestones. Our goal in the discussion today and sharing some of our case studies is maybe we can make this line a little bit more predictable by right-sizing the approach from the start, if we understand what the milestones are. So we're going to walk through some of those milestones we talked about earlier in our actual case studies.
So how do I choose the right path? There are a number of critical choices you need to make when trying to determine the optimal product development strategy for you. And choosing the right pathway can really help reduce development time and cost ultimately. And in extreme cases can make or break a product. And at Ximedica, we work on a wide range of products, all the way from small connected or disposable devices to capital systems, and from startups to multinationals. And for us, that immersion process is really critical. So we ask a ton of questions. I think we said a few key questions. These are a couple of the ones that are probably applicable to almost everyone that we work with. So what are the core unmet needs? Have you spoken to all stakeholders and really taken the time to understand their needs? That's probably seems like an obvious question, but we talk to a lot of companies where ideation comes internally or through insights from the sales team, and which is great, but Have you really gone back to understand, is that really a need that penetrates the entire market? The value proposition, again, a kind of a lofty question, but extremely important when developing the strategy as well as the product itself. Are you trying to reduce procedure setup time, improve clinical outcomes? What's most important in that for your particular device? And market opportunity and fit. What's the size? That could impact sourcing efforts, materials, the design itself. And how does it fit into the clinical workflow? That's something, if you're looking for investment, that investors are certainly going to want to understand. Certainly a lot more risk if you do need to make provisions. And how does that impact clinicians who are going to use the product or patients? And where am I really today? So this is also about level setting and being honest. When we started an engagement, trying to understand, where is our customer? Are there core elements of the technology that need to be de-risked? Are the key requirements fully understood? And it's not realistic or often that we see fully buttoned up requirements early on in a program, but equally important to understand kind of where those gaps are. Regulatory strategy is something certainly probably is neglected a bit or in earlier phases, especially we see with startups that may not have internal regulatory support. But again, it's pretty critical, especially when looking at time to market and choosing the right development approach. Reimbursement and pricing, obviously extremely linked and key inputs to the design team as far as cost targets. Reimbursement has its own whole host of issues that need to be really embedded. And is it reasonable to have answers to all these questions when starting a program? Probably not. But again, it's important to find out kind of where those gaps are and what can be de-risked and when we need to have answers to those questions.
Startup in the robotic surgery space. They had done quite a bit of investment before we had engaged with them a handful of years ago, targeting the typical multi-port robotic surgery companies to enter and be a competitor. Midway through their initial product development process, they decided that they were going to sort of pivot and move towards a single port application versus a multi-port. They saw some opportunities there, also some unmet needs, fewer incisions obviously mean less risk and trauma to the patient, potentially a lower cost per procedure. Everybody's looking for less money out of pocket, and also improved portability and usability of a fairly large piece of capital equipment. We began a fairly lengthy and immersive event to do the full product development and define a few MVPs throughout the course. Ultimately, they did want to get the commercial, but there were some milestones in there, one of which was a funding milestone. It's a fairly intensive amount of capital you need to get a product like this to market. They knew they were going to have to continue to raise money. So we set a target about midway through the product development process to demonstrate to potential funders who were very interested in understanding that this was a viable commercial opportunity. Didn't have to be commercial, but they had to believe that it was going to get the commercial. So we right-sized our product development process to get them there. It was still a prototype, engineering prototype at the end of the day, but we did go out to seek and meet those new unmet needs and opportunities. Developed a product. It took, I see some of our partners here today that helped us along the journey. We had about 6 different organizations that collaborated on this. At any given time, we had 80 individuals working. All the more important to make sure that that minimum viable product, that product definition was really well informed and understood and maintained. You also have a lot of noise. You've got key opinion leaders that want features. You have the owners of the company. You have a changing board. You had our own engineers and user researchers who wanted to idealize everything. So it was really critical to keep the eyes on the prize and say, look, our real objective is to provide something that demonstrates preclinical feasibility by allowing key opinion leaders, primarily a number of surgeons, to operate the device at the prototype level and also make it look believable. This is actually the device. This was an engineering prototype. It's a little bit more refined than we would have typically done early, but that's really what the objective was to help the investors believe that, yeah, that there is a future to this and they're willing to pony up some more money to keep it going. At the end of the day, what did we deliver? We delivered 5 workhorses, show ponies, depending on what our engineers and developers wanted to call them. They did go out for repeated use in preclinical studies, supported investor pitches.
program that really targeted feasibility and proof of concept as kind of the waypoint. I won't call it an endpoint for this particular product. In this example, Ximedica partnered with a startup participating in a local Medtech accelerator to develop a handheld stereoscopic imaging system designed to provide remote monitoring, remote imaging for skin. Based on the insight that there is a well-documented shortage of dermatologists in the US, the device was designed to allow patients or primary clinicians to take high-quality skin images, upload those to the cloud, and get them in the hands of dermatologists much faster for remote diagnosis. The device ultimately takes 2 images of the skin and then uses proprietary technology to interlace those together to create one stereoscopic image. In this case, the focus of the effort was really to bring this technology to life by developing user-centric concepts and prototypes with a focus on image quality and consistency. And ultimately, the goal of the client was to validate their concept and the value proposition with doctors in order to de-risk the program and eventually achieve additional seed funding. At the close of this phase, we delivered approximately 30 traceable devices capable of producing clinical-level images for remote dermatologist diagnosis, as I said, as well as KOL review and field testing. And they were able to, along with a web platform and a mobile app, validate that concept and continue on with development. And overall, this was a pretty low-cost effort given where we got to. In hindsight, this proof of concept approach really was the right strategy for this client. Their business model has continued to evolve and expand over time, and moving it at that time early on in phase 1 for us to a more refined, high-volume commercial solution really would have missed the mark, been more time-consuming, more costly, and premature. So in addition to teledermatology, these devices are currently being used for clinical research as well as machine learning, which is probably where the biggest opportunity is, I'd imagine. And their aim is to kind of really expand the reach of dermatological care well beyond the exam room, and I think they're on their way to doing that.
With this product, Optinose is a specialty pharmaceutical company. We engaged them. They were a startup at the time. Their target is to bring innovative solutions to patients of ENT and allergy specialists. They had approached us with a concept for a technique known as bidirectional nasal administration. Essentially, you breathe into the device while it's inserted in your nostril, and that breathing action closes off your soft palate, shortens your breathing circuit, and allows the medication to stay above your lungs, increases the efficacy of the actual drug. They did have a working prototype when they approached us. What they did recognize is it could not adapt to the user market that they were going after. It accommodated, after a little bit of research, about 70% of the potential market. So they knew that they were leaving 30% on the table. Their first approach to us, well, there's actually two activities that they approached us for. One was expand the usability of the device to capture more of that market. And 2 was to develop clinical 25,000 clinical prototypes for eventual clinical studies. So we took a sort of a bifurcated approach to this. The first was to do the anthropological research on the facial geometry that we needed, particularly the relationship between the nose and the mouth. That didn't exist in literature. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. Unfortunately, that data wasn't readily available. So a big portion of the early work was to develop test methods and equipment to go out and digitally scan hundreds of patients. We then built that data somewhat in parallel. We try to compress schedule. Everything's about time and money, right, in this business. So we were starting down the road of concepting based upon some additional theories of operation. And what we found between an optimization of the actual data that came out of Thermal, I actually have one here, is a little flexibility in a mouthpiece. We got greater than 99% fit across the user population. So they were pretty happy with that. We took that concept, and again, lots of loops in the product development process. We're out confirming that actually, doing early user validation work, pre-formative, informative work. We then moved into developing a device from a minimum viable product perspective. Again, limited budget, limited time, had a desire to get to clinicals. We optimized the rest of the product development process to minimize time by simplifying tooling, simplifying the product design, to get those clinical devices built. Also have helped them produce about close to 1 million pre-production pilot production devices. The good news is they've got 35%, 30 to 35% greater market adoption, which is really what they were after. They have developed some IP along with the outcome, and the company has been evaluated, fairly substantially for, in a fairly quick amount of time. They're well on their way to success. I also want to remark the fluticasone is the first application that they've used this for. It's a nasal polyp reducer. I think the real outcome here that we all want to see is, does it actually have an impact on patients? And it apparently does. The fluticasone using this technique actually reduces polyps better than more traditional inhalers, and is actually reducing the need for surgery. So at the end of the day, they're seeing a very positive outcome for patients.
That we recently completed with was a leading developer and manufacturer of self-injection devices based out of Germany. With this program, aimed us with an early proof of concept prototype for a flexible dose injection pen that was designed to minimize use errors, provide flexibility on the platform, and enable drug manufacturers to get to market faster with their combination devices. In this case, funding was already in place. This wasn't a startup, and there was already interest among pharmaceutical companies. So they asked us to evolve the design to meet and exceed ISO standards, get through design verification, build a manual production line, and single cavity tooling in order to support that process, as well as clinical builds to follow. And so that's what we did. So the beauty of this design is that it really blends or marries the usability of a set dose injection device with the flexibility of a variable dose injection pen. You can click into a series of set doses and easily adapt this again to your particular drug or clinical trial by changing as little as one of the 16 components. This device will be also available as part of a connected system that will enable users or clinicians to monitor compliance or track usage for disease states such as diabetes. So, moving to a kind of a commercial embodiment right out of the concept phase is not necessarily, as we've seen, the best approach for every company, but in this case, it was the right decision for, and so far it's paying dividends. So at the close of this design cycle, again, which we recently completed, we built about 10,000 traceable devices for design verification and clinical use, and the platform is now available for potential drug partners to leverage for their combination device, again, or clinical studies. And now that the device has been de-risked, actually in the process of ramping up their production capacity, and already is partnering with several pharmaceutical companies to bring devices to market. So I wanted to give a shout out as well to Paul Jansen, who's in the room with us today, who's a board member, has been really a linchpin in helping us succeed on this project. So if you're interested or have any more questions around the device, track down Paul.
Speaking about MVP in the context of waypoints or interim milestones, this one's a little bit more straightforward. Acquired a hysteroscopic thermal ablation device years back, and this is for the treatment of menorrhagia. They quickly identified a number of challenges that they knew were not going to sustain the product long term. Primarily usability. It took about 78 steps to get this device up and running. Oftentimes it needed a sales rep in the room to observe, help set up. Talk about lost opportunity. You want your salespeople hanging out, setting equipment up, or you want them out selling. So that was a pretty clear-cut opportunity. And complexity. There's about 26 feet of tubing that was involved in the disposable part of the device. So that obviously contributed to complexity, cost, risk, cleaning. They approached us with a pretty clear-cut engagement in this case, which was to develop a second-generation device addressing all those needs while minimally impacting their existing 510K. Ideally, a letter to file would have been the most ideal situation, and not having to go back and put a lot of effort into resubmitting for the regulatory approach. So we came on board, and the first thing that we sought out was to first seek to understand what we were inheriting. We did quite a bit of user research, observational and contextual research, one-on-one interviews, mapped out the real user needs, the workflow, how it impacted the environment. So looked sort of from the outside in, from a usability perspective, and then look from the inside out. Our intention was not necessarily, it was an evolution, not a revolution. Our intent was to improve the design, not necessarily reinvent the technology, and also to try to maintain as much of the identical functionality of the device to save them from regulatory challenges down the road. And we did that. We did not want to reinvent the wheel, nor did. But ultimately, what we did arrive at is it's primarily a brand new product from bottom up, but it does have equivalency in the outcome of the device. Again, took a long team and a lot of iterative steps to confirm: are we hitting the user needs? Is this going to enter the market and succeed? So a lot of usability work to prove that. At the end, so what's the ultimate outcome? This product was launched a few years after we engaged with. We helped them get it into design verification. The use steps have been cut in half. There's no longer a need for a sales rep in the room. A nurse can operate this device. The user interface is simple enough. It's simple yes and no confirmational steps. If they need help, it will walk them through help through the user interface. Cassette, there's a disposable cassette, cut most of the tubing out of the equation. Cleanability's been improved. And it's, I don't want to say it's completely error-free, but it's as error-free as we believe we designed it. Again, at the end of the day, what's the ultimate impact here? This has been used in about 400,000 procedures and provided more efficacious solutions. So at the end of the day, yeah, that impact to the patient is really what we're after, and it looks like they're making it.
Impact patients, and that's why we really want to help right-size a strategy so that we can help you get to market and launch your products. But ultimately, how do you define your MVP? How do you define your strategy? And then how do you validate and execute on that strategy? So we're going to share some of the tools and tactics that we've used with different organizations. This is not an exhaustive list, but we want to show you some examples. The first being establishing user needs. So this is arguably the most important part of the product development process. And it was interesting because on that poll that we asked earlier, that was one of the biggest challenges. And it definitely presents a challenge. There's not always just one user. This is where I've personally seen projects and companies, struggle or stumble. You really do want to understand the end user or end users, and that's a key point that we'll hit on, and ensure you're getting feedback early and often. There's never too much feedback. It may feel like that, but you really want to bring your MVP out to get feedback from the market as often as you can. This will avoid some of the setbacks you saw on that squiggly development line, and it'll set you on the right path if you really do define and spend that time up front understanding your user needs. One of the things that we do often is we understand and map the patient journey. So what are all the touch points of the device? How is the patient interacting with the device? I'm emphasizing the patient because that's something that we feel strongly at Ximedica. It's all ultimately about the patient, but there are other users that interact with your device, and you need to keep them in mind when you're developing your user needs. So the things that you need to understand how they're interacting with your product. You need to understand the behaviors of all the users, all the stakeholders that are involved in the process. And you need to understand the environments, because that, again, may influence your user needs and ultimately your design inputs for your MVP. So what you see here is a task analysis in the bottom left. This is something that we do. We map out every single step of a process. Let's say it's a clinical procedure. We map out every single step, and we try to understand all the pain points related to all the users involved in that procedure. And those pain points then go to inform both opportunities, market opportunities, but also ultimately your user needs, and then translate into your design inputs.
All of our programs that are even touching on the concept development phase at Ximedica is a concept evaluation ranking tool. So this tool guides users through selecting a handful of key business drivers or development priorities, then really defining what does that mean, and from there working through a pairwise comparison of each of those drivers. So effectively, that's forcing prioritization from one driver against every other driver that you've identified. And typically, we guide or advise our clients to not choose more than 6 or 7 because you start to slice the pie a little bit too thin and it becomes a little watered down. But from there, the tool basically allows or spits out weighted priorities of those handful of drivers. And from there allows you to weight concepts against one another as part of the down selection process. So this is a really important tool that we feel strongly about using at the very beginning of a program, right after the immersion process, but then we like to come back to it as well later on in the concept development process as things can tend to shift. Want to make sure that parties are still aligned on that. In addition to using it for full-blown concepts, it's also really effective for subsystems, features, or even potentially key components in a product. One other interesting thing on this that we've really learned from using it over and over again is that the process and the discussion that it actually occurs when using the tool is sometimes as valuable as the answers that come out of it, right? So you may have on the client side several different functional groups who actually have different opinions on which on priority setting, right? So getting consensus on that is really critical early on so that expectations are set. There also may be requirements that weren't even in the RFQ or even in the early discussions about user needs or product needs that come to life throughout this process. So we find it really valuable. Generational planning. So another common pitfall that can occasionally torpedo a product is trying to design a product that's all things to all people. So we've been talking about user needs a bit, and we'll touch on it a little bit more later. Extremely foundational, but if you try to take everyone's user needs, every stakeholder's user needs and incorporate them into one product, you're going to end up with the over-engineered Swiss Army knife that doesn't fit in your pocket, right? So you're going to have a blown schedule, blown budget, the cost of goods will be too high, and it's probably not a practical product. So this is a tool that can really start to parse out those wants versus needs, look at generational planning, whether you're using the architecture roadmap, which is more of a short-term solution that kind of identifies more of the milestone-based approach and when you would want to add features into the device based on importance and risk versus generational mapping, which is looking at more future launches and when you may want to add functionality down the road. So both of these tools are really useful. One of the things that especially the multi-generational plan also really helps to do is to visualize future-proofing. So for instance, you may have a device, let's say a home use device that eventually you want to get connected, but initially you're going to come out of the gate, it's not going to be a connected device. So 2 to 3 years down the road, you want to add that functionality. The best way to do that may be to actually build the space claim within the device currently, or even add the hardware, even if that functionality may not be enabled at launch. So every situation is different. And then the last thing I'll say on this is that it really helps to kind of dial down the noise. I think Breck mentioned that earlier to the team. So there's always asks that happen throughout the project. There's always additional feedback that comes in. It's great. But this gives you a place to kind of look back and say, what did we say? Did we figure out if we wanted to include this need in the first generation? If not, do we need to revise our plan, or do we just table that discussion for a future generation of the product? And then last tactic we'll talk about today, user feedback sessions. So I promise this is the last time we're going to talk about user needs, but really we do believe really strongly in getting user feedback, and not just in the beginning to establish those needs, but also kind of throughout the concept generation and early engineering effort to make sure that you kind of stay on the right track. So really design, test, refine, and repeat that process as often as possible. And we utilize a bunch of different tools for that early on. We really focus on KOL interviews, phone interviews, concept feedback research, and while KOLs are extremely important, I think from our experience that probably represents only maybe 10% of the market. So you really want to go out and make sure you get that other 90% of untrained users. There's also been an extremely increased focus from the FDA on mitigating use errors. So understanding how those untrained, naive users are going to use your product early on in the development process when you still have the ability to kind of quickly pivot is really important. So we kind of leverage those tools early on in our concept phase, and then as the design progresses, recommend using early formative studies. Some of our products we've done 1, some we've done 3, leading up to design freeze to make sure that you've done the appropriate refinements for usability and mitigation of those use errors prior to locking the design down and moving into a final summative study.